The CMO Confidential podcast is a proud member of the I Hear Everything podcast network. Looking to launch or scale your podcast? I Hear Everything delivers podcast production, growth, and monetization solutions that transform your words into profit. Ready to give your brand a voice? Then visit iheareverything.com.
Welcome to CMO Confidential, the podcast that takes you inside the drama, decisions, and choices that go with being the head of marketing. Hosted by five-time CMO Mike Linton.
Welcome, marketers, advertisers, and those who love them to Chief Marketing Officer Confidential. CMO Confidential is a show that takes you inside the drama, the decisions, and the politics that go with being the head of marketing at any company in what is one of the most scrutinized jobs in the executive suite. I'm Mike Linton, the former Chief Marketing Officer of Best Buy, eBay, Farmers Insurance, and Ancestry.com. Here today with my guest, Richard Sanderson. Today's topic, dissecting compensation, a primer on understanding, negotiating, and managing pay. Now, Richard began his career at Russell Reynolds and Booz and Company, and he moved on to Spencer Stuart, where he leads the marketing, communications, and sales practice. He leads approximately 25 searches a year for CMOs, CROs, CCOs, and sales leadership position. Now, this is his fourth time on the show in our 3-year run, and we consider him a CMO Confidential OG. Full disclosure, we've known each other for quite a while. Richard recruited me to the Allworth Financial Board. Welcome back, Richard.
Thank you, Mike. Fourth time is a pleasure. Does that mean I'm getting a cut of some of the advertising revenue soon?
You know, as soon as we get some, yeah. And then we're going to send you a hypothetical jacket that you can wear conceptually. So, hey, let's just start about, why we want to talk about compensation is it's a topic that everyone thinks about. It consumes a lot of discussion and backroom thinking, but it's not often discussed in the open. And so, it'd be great to break it into sections, the basic elements, negotiating comp, and then managing comp. And I thought we'd start with the building blocks, salary, bonus, and equity. Give us just a takedown on that.
Okay, well, first of all, Mike, you're right. This is a fascinating topic. It's actually a bit of a mysterious topic because certainly at the marketing leadership level, the reality is there is very little public information out there. Right. And not only that, as we all know, compensation is it's a topic which you don't talk about in polite company. So it is a somewhat mysterious area shrouded in mystery, and yet it's all we want to know about, and we all want to talk about it, and we all want to make sure we're doing the best we can. And I'll just tell you how little public information there is out there. I mean, for example, we have looked at the proxy statements of the largest Fortune 1000 companies. So that's the largest companies by the revenue or market cap. And as folks may know, if you look at the proxy statement, they are required to list named executive officers, which is typically the 5 highest paid officers in the company. Of 1,000 proxy statements, Mike, for 2024, we can only find references to marketing leaders at 41 of those.
Wow.
So approximately only 4% of companies have a marketing officer as one of their top 5 compensated employees. And even then, when we do look at those titles, the role is often broader than pure marketing.
So that's where you're getting your super CMOs, right?
Correct, exactly. These may be the CMO pluses, the CMO plus pluses, call them what you like. Chief revenue, chief commercial, chief growth. There are a handful of what I call pure CMOs in there, but the sample size is really small. And hence it sort of adds a little bit to the, am I being paid at market? Is it fair? Am I getting the best deal? Can I do better? It all adds to the difficulty of this conversation.
Especially when you throw in the equity component, which can skew a year or 2 years versus a true pay plan.
Yeah, correct.
Because you got salary, bonus, and then equity. So kind of just take us through those 3 things, and then we'll jump into equity.
So let's start with salary. That's obviously the piece that everyone knows. This is, I would say, base salary is the number that when we are negotiating compensation, This is the number that most people focus on. I think your base salary is a bit of a psychological anchor for everyone. I think to some extent it's a reflection of where you are in your career and your recognition. I think to make a move, most people are expecting their base salary to increase. To me, it's the most visible and emotionally resonant part of the package, and the base salary number itself is nearly always open to negotiation when you change roles. What I would say to people is be aware of either company or industry norms
Yeah.
around base salaries. For example, financial services firms may offer low base salaries but higher bonuses.
Yeah.
And many large companies have essentially what they call salary grades or salary bands. So at a certain level of seniority, there is a window. It may be small, it may be large, but there is a limit to that puts a range on salary. Bonuses are most commonly expressed as a percent of base salary. There'll often be conditions in there. It's tied to either company performance, business unit performance, individual performance, some blend of all of the above. I find when negotiating offers, actually bonuses is actually probably the hardest bit to negotiate on, because they are set percentages of base salaries, and that percentage is often reflective of the level or the band or the range of the role that we were going into. I think the key question to ask about bonuses is, what has been the bonus payout history over the last 3 years? So where has the bonus paid relative to target, above target, at target, or below target? And I think that reveals whether the targets are realistic, and also a little bit about recent company performance. The final big area, and you hinted at this, Mike, it's equity. This is complex. The devil is in the detail, as they say, and there's a lot of detail here. Long-term incentives, equity, really are a major part, particularly of CMO pay, particularly in public companies. There are lots of different types.
Hey, before we go into different types, I just want to get your advice for our listeners on this. While base salary is often the most emotional, really where you end up making usually a lot of money is in the equity piece. Maybe sometimes you get a big kicker in the bonus, but it's really equity. And when you're younger, maybe you're not paying that much attention to equity and you're more fixated on base salary. Is that true or not?
Partially. So we'll come back to equity in a second, because we were talking about equity, a salary or compensation components. Where you're getting to, Mike, is a slightly different point, which is compensation mix.
Yeah. Okay.
Now this is an important point too. So this is a balance of what's short-term compensation is basically referring to base and bonus. Long-term reflects equity. Now the mix depends on a whole bunch of issues. So let me give you some example. Ownership. If a company is public versus private, or private equity, or even non-profits. Non-profits, some private, family-held companies, for example, simply may not issue equity in the form of a private equity portfolio company. There's all sorts of conditions attached to that, and we may come back to that in a moment. The more traditionally understood is this sense of either restricted stock units, options, equity. Now, the mix bit is important, Mike, because there are some stylistic differences, not only around ownership structure, but I'll give you another example, geographic differences. In my experience, American-based companies do lean much more heavily into equity as a part of the compensation mix. Companies based out of Europe, on the other hand, actually do not.
Right.
And I typically will see, if we're negotiating an offer with a client for a European headquartered business, typically equity is actually a smaller part of the total compensation package. So there are all sorts of stylistic, ownership, and other structural issues that impact that mix that you're talking about, short-term versus long-term.
So give us the little primer on the various types of equity.
Yeah. Okay. So look at it at its highest level. The two most common forms were what were called RSUs, restricted stock units, and options. Restricted stock units are essentially straightforward issuance of equity at the market price. You can sit there and work it out. People have their online portals they can go into, and it directly correlates with the rise or fall in share price.
And the way an RSU would work, just to make sure everyone gets it right, is you get a bunch of stock, it's at $10 a share, you get 100 shares that vest at X time. If it's at $10, that's what you get. If it's at $12, that's what you get. And if it's at $1, that you just get the same number of shares, right?
Correct. So they have value essentially no matter where the share price is, as long as the share price is not at zero.
Right.
There is some value associated with them. There's a whole talk about vesting cycles. We can come back to that in a second. The next variant is options. So options have something called a strike price. So you'll hear people talk about, am I in the money or not? Valuing options is a lot more complicated. There's various mathematical models, Black-Scholes being the most commonly attributed one. It's complex. I would say options are essentially a little bit more risky. If they go up, there's substantial increase in value. If they go below the strike price, there's no value whatsoever, and you're on what's referred to as being underwater.
And that's where we go back to our example. If you get the options at $10, you don't make any money unless the stock goes up.
Yeah.
And if the stock goes down to $9 versus 10, you're $1 underwater.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. And more recently, I've seen now a significant part of equity compensation is what's called performance share units, so PSUs. Now these are essentially, in my opinion, a juiced up variant of restricted stock units. They're essentially issued conditionally, and it will often be associated with the company meeting various strategic targets, various KPIs or metrics. And performance share units can have accelerators or even decelerators on them based on where the company is meeting those particular targets. The most common example I've seen is that they'll tell you, look, here's the value, and they can increase 0 to 200% based on whether we're going to hit some of these key metrics that are defined in the market.
And those metrics examples might be either sales targets or total shareholder return.
Yeah, correct. It's defined by the board of directors. It's trying to align the entire company and the team around various targets. It can be sales targets, can be profitability targets, can be earnings per share targets. I mean, there's almost an infinite array of metrics against which you can set these performance share units.
Yeah, I ran 2 comp committees and public boards, and there is an infinite amount of arguing that could go with this infinite amount of metrics as well.
Right. So that's the types of equity. Then there's so when can you actually realize them? When can you take them off the table? And so this is obviously vesting. Fundamentally, there's 2 types of vesting. By far the most common is time-based vesting. So literally you are running out the clock. The most common form used to be what was referred to as a cliff vest at 3 years. So in other words, at 3 years from issuance, you could essentially sell them.
And to make sure everyone knows what you mean by vesting, that is when you get a chance to buy it. Yeah.
When you actually get a chance to monetize.
It becomes yours.
Correct. It becomes more than just a number on an online portal that says what it could be worth, to a point where you could actually sell it.
Yes.
If you want to do it. Before then, it's all paper money.
Yes. Thank you.
It has some value, but you cannot monetize it until you get to the vesting.
And if you leave before you vest, often you're forfeiting everything, right?
Often. That's also up for negotiation. That's probably one of the points we'll come to. I would say we're seeing lots of variance on time-based equity. The 3-year cliff vest was very typical. Certainly on, I'd say, West Coast or more technology companies have moved to an accelerated schedule. There's often now a cliff at 1 year, and now in some cases even monthly vesting, 1/24th or 1/36th, for example, or even 1/48th each month now. Now that helps with cash flow, but just to say that 3-year cliff vest that used to be very typical, even that now has iterated quite substantially over the different types of time vesting. For any public company, by the way, I mean, this is all stated in the proxy statement. What you can't really do is individually negotiate, what your vesting cycle is going to be. I mean, there is a program, that is the structure. You cannot negotiate it. You're either in or you're out. And so I don't want people thinking, they can start individually negotiating components like that. It's not. I think we're simply identifying that there are many different types of equity, vesting cycles of equity, and how they exist, and valuation models as well.
And then, so there's time, and then there's performance, which performance equity or performance
Yeah.
RSUs, which is, yeah, we
Right.
kind of talked about
Yes.
them.
And there's one more. There can be event-based vesting. I mean, this can be linked, for example, to an IPO, a sale of a company. So if a company comes in and buys your company, I mean, they're essentially buying up all the equity on the spot. So
Right.
that's an example of more an event-based trigger as opposed to a time-based trigger.
So, we're going to talk about like negotiating now, because you got to figure out, this is super complicated when you really get, particularly when you get into the equity portion we just talked about. How do you recommend candidates think through comp?
Yep.
Usually even before they're looking at gigs and how they get paid, but give us advice for how to
Yeah.
think about this.
So I think there's at least 3 or 4 subtopics here, Mike. I'll just lay them on the table and you can decide which ones you want to go through here. I think first of all, and I'm now really in the mode, sort of in the executive recruiter mode, which is what I'm in, which is how and when do you negotiate compensation? And I'm specifically in the situation of when you may be considering changing roles or changing companies. So topic number 1 to discuss would be, when is the right time to discuss compensation? Topic number 2 that I encourage people to be aware of is, what are some of the new compensation and pay equity laws that may frame that conversation? Number 3 is, how do you manage the expectation setting element of compensation negotiations? And then what is the right style or posture to take during a negotiation? So there's lots of different things, and Mike, I'm very happy to go through these at a high level one by one.
Yeah, let's just touch on the first one, because also in that is know what you're getting paid now, so
Right.
you don't like, I've
Right.
had people leave like 2 months ahead of getting massive grants
Right.
because
Yes,
they
exactly.
weren't paying attention.
Right. So first of all, when to discuss compensation with a recruiter or a company. So when in the process. And I think timing is delicate. I think if you start asking about compensation too early, you risk coming across as overly focused just on the money side, as opposed to the challenge or the opportunity. On the other hand, if you leave the conversation too late, you may be wasting time if your expectations don't align with where the company or the role wants to pay.
Right.
There is an element of negotiation theory that says, look, the first person to put a number out there is essentially setting the anchor
Right.
negotiation. I do think there is some truth to that, but that anchor that you throw out also has to be grounded in some sort of reality. You can't just throw out, I think, silly numbers, because I think you lose your
Unless you are Elon Musk, apparently. So
I think we're looking at $1 trillion, I heard at
yeah,
some
I
point.
think so.
And then, I think also be ready with what is the right response. And we'll come to this in a second, because increasingly now recruiters and their representatives are essentially trained to ask about expectations, not about compensation history. And the reason for that, Mike, is a number of compensation and pay equity laws have passed on a state level, not a federal level, to be clear, on a state level over the last 10 years. California, New York City, Oregon, Delaware, Massachusetts, Illinois, the state of Washington, and others. I mean, put bluntly, it's the blue coastal states, Mike.
Right.
Is where a lot of this is happening, where now recruiters are actually prohibited asking about compensation history. Instead now, and certainly everyone at Spencer Stuart is trained to ask about expectations, not about history. To be clear, candidates and you can still volunteer your history. It's not required, but we
Right.
cannot directly ask it. Now, here's my honest experience of handling this, Mike. When I ask the compensation expectations question, most people do not know how to answer that question.
Yeah.
For exactly the reason we said, if I set a number too high or too low, I'm going to look stupid, or I'm leaving something on the table, I'm going to come across as greedy. I'm not going to 80 to 90% of people do not know how to answer the expectations question. And they end up reverting to, well, look, here's where I am, because that's the one number they know. So
Right.
Inadvertently, candidates may choose to share history, but just be aware, recruiters in many jurisdictions cannot and should not and will not directly ask you about your compensation history. What they can do and should ask you about is what's referred to as forfeitures. So if you were to walk away, what are you leaving on the table? This was your point. I mean, are you leaving at the right time? When is something vesting? What do we need to be aware of? What short-term annual bonus could you be leaving on the table?
Right. If I'm 3 months ahead of bonus, I'm leaving a lot bonus maybe on the table.
Particularly acute for searches being run this time of year. So, late Q3 and Q4. Most companies run on a fiscal year that aligns to the calendar year. Bonuses are paid typically January through coming to the final quarter now. You are essentially, if you leave in Q4, you are essentially giving up most of your last year's accrued bonus. How is that going to be taken care of or accounted for? That's an example of a forfeiture. All the equity we spoke about, what is it worth over what period of time? When is it going to vest? If you leave, are you giving it up? That is a forfeiture. A recruiter could, and should ask you about that, and you should be ready to address and answer that question. This is a broader point around what these compensation laws are, and what you need to be ready for. This expectations thing, as I said, look, that is the topic that I think most people struggle with. What I would say is, look, do a little bit of research, use recruiters, use your peer networks, maybe even use some proxy statements where relevant. Although, as I said at the beginning, 4% of companies even have a marketing leader on their proxy statement. But be thoughtful. Put an aspirational. Anything that's too high or too low can frankly send the wrong signal.
And beneath all this, I'm hearing know how you get paid, know how your company rules are in terms of vesting, bonus, because the bonus may get paid at the end of the year, but you also may have to be in seat in February 15th or March 15th to get it.
That is correct.
So you really want to know the rules, and you don't want to be fumbling around with it. And then how, you were telling us how to manage the question about what are your expectations. Are there any other best practices in there?
Well, here's where I would go with the expectations question. I get all sorts of responses to this. I mean, part of it is, a savvy candidate will actually turn the question around on me.
Right.
I mean, it's not, and in most cases, I'm not flying blind. I mean, most recruiters are going into a role in a search with some knowledge, roughly speaking. It may not be gospel truth, but directionally where the role is. Again, a recruiter doesn't want to, tip their hand too much or give too much away. So it's a really delicate dance. But I find the more savvy, sophisticated candidate will actually push it back and put me in a slightly awkward.
And do a thing like, hey, Richard, do they have a range they are thinking about for this job?
Precisely. So I would actually think about pushing back on that. It's not so much pushing back, but actually responding to a question with a question, almost making it rhetorical, and seeing what information that may reveal. I mean, at the end of the day, Mike, this is all about information asymmetry.
Yeah.
The recruiter has more information than you do about compensation of the role, and they're trying to. This is not the right. I don't want to say they're trying to exploit that. That is not the case. But they are trying to get to a solution that works for their client. Remember, recruiters, executive search consultants are paid by clients. They're not paid by candidates.
Right.
And so they want to do what's right by the client. Now, what I will say to my clients is, you are not only looking to recruit a candidate, you're looking to retain a candidate as well over the long term. So being, penny wise but pound foolish on compensation negotiation often can backfire.
So you had your 4 things. Did we get through all 4 here?
I'll give you one other, which I think is really interesting, which is once you get into a negotiation. So how does negotiation actually work? My general feeling and experience is there's typically one round of negotiation.
You get one big ask after you get this.
So in other words, let's say you're the chosen candidate. You've gone through all the interviews. Probably the referencing has been done. All the background checks have been done. The offer is forthcoming. There may have been some expectation setting, or there may have not before you received the offer. But now you get the offer. In most cases, the offer is expressed verbally first.
Right.
And then, can you accept this offer? Yes or no. In my experience, that is your moment as a candidate. That is your moment of highest leverage. They've made it clear they want you. They've probably maybe even switched off most of the other candidates. So the eggs are all in the basket here. They want you, they want to make it work. You haven't committed. This is your greatest moment of leverage. That said, it is about doing the right thing. In my experience, this is your opportunity now to respond to this and very clearly say, look, based on this is what I think I need to make it work.
And you really get one shot at this, right? You can say, look, I understand the rules, but I would, I'm leaving a lot of equity on the table. Will you, is there anything you can do with that?
Right.
And then how many things can you ask for?
Well, okay, so we'll come to that in a second. So,
all right.
So yeah, now look, a good recruiter should have worked with you to uncover the issues.
Right.
All these forfeitures that we spoke about, ideally, Mike, that should have been covered weeks ago. There should not be at this point new news or surprises to either party in this negotiation. Now, what you also have to understand, and I try and get this from my clients, is look, some clients come with what I'll call a full and fair offer up front. This is it. It's basically best and final, or I'd say very close to best and final. There may be a little bit of wiggle room, but this is it. We're not trying to, we're not trying to do any funny business here. We're trying to give you a full and a fair offer. Or look, there are legitimately some companies that love to negotiate, that love to go through a round, maybe two, of negotiation. And again, working with your recruiter, whether it's an external agent or an employee in the talent department of the company, just getting a sense of how a company runs negotiation, what rounds of negotiation you should expect, understanding the company's approach. That is really critical.
Hey, when the recruiter says this is their best and final offer, how do you know if that's true or that's a negotiating tack from the company? Because no one says, this is my first offer, give me a counter.
So this is where, look, there's a little bit of brokering that goes on. This is why I actually think it's helpful to sometimes use an executive, not sometimes, but to use an executive search firm, because I think it can, when there's a third party involved, I mean, it's the same, when anyone buys or sells a house, it can get quite heated. You all have different views on what your house is worth and what someone should be paying for it. And I think, look, the same is true about ourselves and our services. And I think using a broker to try and take some of the heat out of the negotiation that can truly broker a win-win relationship for both parties, that is where I'd say, look, trust your recruiter. That many of them have been doing this for many years, if not decades. They generally know what they're doing, and they're just as vested as you in getting this done and moving on.
When they're there, they don't want to go back to go unless they have a really good number.
No recruiter wants to go back to a restart. So look, I think there is some sense of being open, being honest. All parties, I haven't found that anyone comes to these negotiations trying to screw someone over, Mike. I just have not experienced that. It is about how do we find the best available outcome for all parties involved. I do think there is a lot of good faith that exists in these situations.
How about other things like the one-offs in an earlier show you mentioned about moving the horses?
Yes.
There's severance deals, which is, I know I'm going to a higher risk job. Are you going to give me a severance package? Well, how do people think about those?
Right. And so this is where I say, look, even if you can't get the base salary number or the bonus number, for example, to be exactly where you want it to be, there are so many other potentially negotiable elements beyond pay.
Right.
So severance, sign-on bonuses, we'll talk about that in a second maybe, relocation, start date, work location, travel allowances, or even, there are some unusual perks. I think that joke, which you always bring up with me, is when there was a negotiation about the horse stabling costs.
Yeah.
Had to relocate. I mean, there is some literally crazy stuff that can occur from time to time. My point is there are many other elements beyond just base and bonus to think about here. I mean, the one we probably should talk about, because this does come up a lot, is severance and separation.
Let's talk about it.
So look, Spencer Stuart, as you know, for many years has been publishing a tenure study about the average tenure of a chief marketing officer. And guess what? It's 4.3 years. That is not particularly long. Now, as you and I have discussed, Mike, it's not that different from the average C-suite member, which is actually about 4.9 years. But it's below average.
Yeah.
And given the short tenure of chief marketing officers, there is a discussion around should they quote unquote protect themselves.
Yes, and that's average. So on the bottom end of that curve is 1 and 2 years.
Right.
So yeah.
Now look, this can be really quite interesting. Here's what I'll tell you up front. Look, there are some companies that just have a straightforward policy around severance and separation. All their C-suite members, or however far down the organization they choose to extend this offer, are essentially there's a company policy. We're all going to follow it, and if something happens, then that will come into force. To be clear, if you involuntarily leave, so for example, if you resign of your own accord to take another job, there's no severance or separation there. Similarly, if you are fired for cause, so you commit a crime or something, there's clauses where this doesn't apply. So first of all, check number one: is there a company-wide policy under which this role falls? If not, again, when we spoke about being at that moment of negotiation of greater leverage, that is the moment to ask. And what I say to candidates is, look, the worst thing they can do is say no.
Right.
It's the worst thing they can do. And then in many instances, look, where there is a severance or separation policy, again, it's company by company. I'd say the most common might be around 6 months. Occasionally, I'll see 12 months. It might be 3 months. I mean, everything's there, but in most cases, there will be a standard policy. You are not the first person to ask about this, I can assure you. But do ask, because again, this is your moment to do it.
And is this the thing you should ask through the recruiter? Because all this stuff is way better through the recruiter than directly through the company, right?
I am of the belief that you are correct, Mike. I think that using a third party broker negotiator, as I said, just takes the sting, the heat, or the emotion out of this. I'm most concerned if people are seen, candidates are seen as greedy. I know in many cases that is not the case. They're generally trying to protect themselves, and this may be a very pertinent issue for a company that is going through some sort of transformation, is having some major performance issues. I think it is the right thing to ask about, but at the same time, you don't want to offend people.
Right. I think it's way better to go through the search firm, and also if they've had a CMO or two blow out in the last 3 years, and you're coming in, there's a little bit of a track record where you don't want to ask that question, but the search firm can probably do a better job of it.
Yeah, so, I think that's right.
Hey, so I want to make sure we're done with negotiation, and if we are, I want to flip over to kind of just thinking about comp in general. But anything else on negotiation you want to talk about?
No, I think we've covered the main topics.
All right. Well, so let's talk about, you're looking at all these proxy statements and you think, wow, I'm not in the name executive officers and all my peers feel like they are. I feel undervalued. I feel underpaid, or I read about so-and-so getting this ginormous stock grant and I don't have any of that. How do you recommend marketers think about how they get paid here?
Yeah, so look, I think there's probably two things to think about here. One is for yourself, what you do if you personally are feeling underpaid. There's another subtopic here which we might want to come on to, which is how do you manage subordinates?
That's going to be the next question.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to pop on that because first you got to get your head on right about, am I paid fairly?
Right. So look, this is always such a difficult topic. I mean, I challenge you to find anyone who thinks that they're overpaid. I mean,
I always wanted one of my people to come in and go, Mike, you're overpaying me. I want to give some money back.
I mean, let's go. I mean, everyone to some extent probably feels they're leaving a little bit on the table. But look, this is a really difficult topic. I mean, I think I'm a fairly data-driven individual, but as I said at the beginning, Mike, there's actually very little public data out. It's really hard, and so inevitably, these conversations get tricky because it comes down to anecdotal data. Worse, you may be comparing yourself to your peers, your colleagues, your co-workers in the company. So then it seems either resentful or even jealousy. It's really difficult. Look, I'd simply say this: if you truly believe you're undervalued, try and gather some data and have a direct conversation with your manager. Try and use where you can and where it exists, market data, peer benchmarks, even recruiter insights, to support your case.
Right. And then, so if you conclude you are actually relatively fairly paid, but you realize, gosh, the company values, say I'm a financial institution and they value loan officers more than they value the marketers, which makes actually a lot of sense. Or maybe in retail, they value the merchants more. How do I manage my subordinates through this in a way that calms them down and keeps them from getting a bug about how they get paid?
Yeah. Look, again, I recognize this is a tricky one. I'm sure everyone on there has team members that at some point have probably approached them about this topic. I mean, I have always felt when it comes to compensation that sunlight, to the extent that exists, is the best disinfectant. And what I mean by that is, look, be transparent about pay structures and market realities. I would often say, hey, by the way, to a team member, have you actually read the proxy statement? I mean, there's actually a lot of detail in there.
There is a lot of detail in the proxy.
I mean, often 20 plus pages of excruciating detail.
Yes, it's not. They're not going to make a movie out of it.
No. I mean, it's not exactly riveting stuff, but at least it is transparent. Now, look, I recognize this is only for public companies. For a private company, and then obviously this is not an option. But I would, at a public company, I would strongly encourage, sharing with a team member, go and read the proxy statement, and tell me what your concerns are based on that. We are all operating under the same, we're all operating on the same structure to some extent, but there's some insights that you'd like to learn further about from the proxy statement. Then let's have that conversation.
And one of the things about the proxy statement is, all the shareholder services groups have torn that thing apart for say on pay. So this is not something that is some esoteric thing. This is like, you should go read the proxy statement to understand a lot. How about when the equity is underwater and your team comes in and says, hey, Richard, all my equity's underwater. The best thing I can do right now is change companies and reboot my equity. And just because, they'll start me at zero and I'm already underwater by $5.
Well, first of all, I think you have to be empathetic in those situations. I think you have to acknowledge the frustration that may exist. But I think as a manager, as a leader, as a chief marketing officer, this is your opportunity to communicate the long-term vision and the potential upside. I mean, let's be honest, I don't know many chief marketing officers that single-handedly can move the share price of a company. We're all part of a larger entity or organism, but in many instances, and you've heard me preach about this before, the reason I am so excited about the long-term future of marketing is because it is the growth driver of the company. So everyone there is with you there in the engine room, and you have perhaps more control over your destiny than perhaps you might realize. So I do think this is a moment to, as I said, acknowledge the challenge, but also very clearly, I think, set the vision and restore the faith.
And the other thing is, hopefully your company is refreshing, not repricing, but refreshing the option pool or the RSUs every year so that you're getting them at a low price.
Yeah.
For this year. So understanding that proxy statement is a big deal.
Correct. Yeah. Look, and I'll be honest, some of it is dumb luck. I mean, here's another data point I'll give you. Most companies, when they're issuing annual equity, are typically doing it around March or April.
Yeah.
Guess what happened this March or April of 2025? Do you remember we had Liberation Day?
Yeah.
Markets took an absolute dump, for a short while. And now, by the way, they're up stronger than ever, and I understand the S&P is hitting new records every day. Right. If you, through dumb luck, happen to get your equity issuance at a certain, I forget exactly when it was, but a certain date in late March or early April.
Right, you're just in the money the day after you get it.
You're probably already looking at a 20% return this year. On the other hand, if you happen to be issued equity the day before, it probably wasn't looking great. So look, some of it is just in the lap of the gods here, Mike. We can't control everything.
And the other thing I would say, having spent a lot of time with comp, is if you look at 1 year, there's always something where you're either really lucky or you really got screwed, and you should try and look at comp over time and think, am I getting fair comp over time versus can you fix the Liberation Day problem that just smacked me?
Yeah.
I also have never had anybody come in and go, we got the stock the day after Liberation Day and we're up. We feel we're being compensated unfairly, positively. We'd like to take a lesser bonus.
Yeah, no, exactly. You're never going to hear about someone complaining about the upside. You're only going to hear about the downside.
Hey, any other comp practices, best practices we have missed in our chat?
There is one very important one. And this is something I will do on pretty much every offer for any major role that has a lot of complexity to it. And that is you need to do, it's simple. It's a multi-year cash flow analysis. Typically a 5-year cash flow analysis. You got your, what I'll call your steady state. So, here's where you are today. Here's your base. Here's your bonus at target. Here's your expectations of equity. And, you're going to do it via vesting. So it's actually, a real cash in hand, W-2 sort of look at what you're getting. And then you're going to compare it to the offer.
Yeah.
And you're going to do this over 5 years, and you're going to figure out where there's a delta. Now, in my experience, there is typically sometimes a negative delta or a negative gap, sometimes in year 1 and year 2. Here's why. When you are issued equity, for example, as part of your compensation package, we spoke about vesting cycles, Mike, at the top of this podcast.
Yep.
Sometimes it's a 3-year cliff. So in other words, the numbers look good on paper, but you're not from a cash flow perspective, you're not seeing any of it until year 3. Whereas if you stayed where you were, you've got that cash flow continually coming through as you're now in the middle of these or realizing these vesting cycles. And so, this cash flow analysis over 5 years can really reveal where there are going to be some meaningful gaps as to what you would actually experience, literally cash in your bank account or in your wallet. That can be very, very revealing and very important to do. What I nearly always find is there may be a gap in year 1 and 2, but nearly always, once you hit year 3 and beyond, then it really takes off as the equity accelerates. So now, again, this is part of a point of negotiation. Do you go back to your counterpart and ask for some sort of sign-on or bridge payment, call it what you will, in year 1 and year 2? Will they handle that or not? Is that negotiable, yes or no? And what does that gap look like?
Right, especially if you have to buy a new house or something in a higher cost neighborhood, you really want to do your homework here.
Well, so now you bring up another point, which I wasn't sure we were going to get to, but one of the challenges now, it is financially punitive to relocate. Many people have locked themselves into a sub 3% mortgage, and until a few weeks ago, I understand 30-year mortgage is running close to 7%.
Yeah, which is
there are some substantial financial costs now associated with relocation, which we didn't really see a few years ago.
So lots to think about. Anything else before we get to our traditional last question?
Look, all sorts of things covered in negotiation. Titles. Do you have the C title?
Yeah.
SVP, VP, head of marketing, exec. Look, there's a whole bunch of things that, again, that would normally be established up front. You've probably seen even a job spec that spells out what the role should be, but sometimes there's some negotiation on titles. Again, the reporting line, typically that's fixed. That stayed in the job spec. That's typically not open for negotiation. Here's something that does come up: non-compete and non-solicitation agreements.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
That may exist in offer letters, or in many instances, it may not exist in an offer letter. You may be presented with a bunch of documents on day 1 that no one told you was coming your way. You should potentially just better understand how issues like that are handled and what are you walking into. So there's an almost infinite number of topics, Mike, but I think I'll leave it there.
I have one more I want to ask. A lot of people will say you should never get to the point where you turn down a written offer. That is unless the company blows it up or changes it. How do you feel about that statement?
Well, there's an assumption, which is by the time you've got to a written offer, you have already negotiated the elements. And typically I'm working with my clients, as I said, to agree to get to a verbal yes,
right,
before the written offer letter goes out. If you have got to the point where the written offer letter has gone out and you say no, something has gone terribly wrong, either in the process or conditions that weren't being made aware of, or, and this is sort of shame on the recruiter for not figuring this out, you may frankly be looking at two situations side by side, and look, the other firm has got to the finish line first. I mean, here's the reality, and most of the offers that we're handing out from our clients, you've basically got a week max,
Right.
max to sign on the dotted line, or the offer expires.
And a
So
lot of times the company has to go to the board of directors or other people to get specific
correct.
things approved. And so when you get to the written offer, if you don't close it, it
Right.
also makes you feel pretty bad as the hiring.
Correct. So that's why we're doing all this sort of pre-close work before we get a written offer. No CHRO or even CEO wants to go back to their comp committee multiple times negotiating an offer. So look, I think that's a highly unlikely situation. I'll tell you one thing that really is problematic, which is you accept the offer verbally, you accept the offer on the written offer, and you sign, and then you renege on the offer.
Wow.
It's rare, but it does happen occasionally, but it's rare. I would say in searches I'm working on, happens once every 2 years or so. So it is pretty rare.
But one out of 50, 1 out of 50.
Yeah, 1 out of 50. So, as I said, not a lot,
Yeah.
but it does happen. There are all sorts of reasons it can happen. The biggest risk is when there is a large difference between the moment when someone resigned and their start date, which is why many companies are pushing you, resign ASAP and would like you to start a couple of weeks later. I have very few clients that are comfortable saying, yeah, you go resign now and we'll see you on January 1. That's you're asking for trouble.
You're begging for problems.
You are asking for trouble. But it does occasionally happen, particularly in financial services, where there's often required notice periods or gardening leaves built into
the garden leave, where you just have to hang out and can't do anything.
right,
Yeah.
built into employment contracts. So look, there is some risk, but that is a real challenge, I think, both for your reputation.
That probably follows you around forever.
That's a reputational challenge that can be a real problem.
All right. Well, this brings us to this has been a great chat. Thank you. This brings us to our last question. You're very familiar with it. It's a two-parter. Practical advice we haven't yet discussed for our listeners, and or funniest story you want to share.
Well, I've exhausted all my funny stories, Mike. So now I'm back to some practical advice.
All right. Very good.
Which is where I think I've been for the last couple of podcasts. So here's what's coming up right now in interviews. I obviously ask candidates, how the interview go, what do they talk to you about, what do they want to know. Here's what I'm telling people: you got to be ready for the AI question. It is literally coming up now in every interview for every chief marketing officer role. How are you using it? What are your use cases? What impact is it having? How are you working with the CFO? You got to have now some nicely packaged AI anecdotes about the impact and transformation that AI is having on your business and on your team. It's not the first question out of an interviewer's lips, but I can assure you it's definitely the second, third, or fourth. And so this is moving away from, walk me through your resume or tell me about, the time you did this. The AI topic is front and center now in interviews. I think it's being used as a proxy for broader based, I would say, agility, transformation,
curiosity, learning,
to manage cost and optimize. But the AI question is being asked now in pretty much every single interview I'm hearing about.
Well, I think that is a great way to end the show. So thank you, Richard, and thanks to everyone for listening to CMO Confidential. Look for our other shows on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube, which include Colonel Mustard in the Study with the Job Spec, Why Con Can't, and Richard's earlier shows, two of which are A Rapid Evolution in the Marketplace, the Spencer Stuart CMO 2024 study, and It Was the Best of Times, It Was the Worst of Times, a marketing perspective. Hey, all you marketers, stay safe out there. This is Mike Linton signing off for CMO Confidential.